And again, on Sunday mornings, we're doing Matthew chapter 24. And Jesus in Matthew 24 is going through and talking about the end times, specifically the tribulation period. He says it's one of the worst times that the world has ever seen. Actually, the worst time that the world has ever seen. Up until that point, where's my wife? Those tiny bees. Up until that point, never shall be. In the book of Daniel, in chapter 11, starting in verse 36, this comes from a series of prophecies that take place concerning what's called the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the south is Egypt, and all the way through to the end, up till verse 35, the king of the north is Syria. And what that's talking about is the Alexander the Great conquered the known world. Then when he died, they divided up that kingdom between four of his generals. And two of the generals, one of the generals took Syria up to the north, that's up that direction, and the other one took Egypt down to the south. And they had battles back and forth. The lineages, the families that came from those two kings had battles back and forth. So Daniel chapter 11 is one of the most amazing prophecies in the Bible because it's talking about this back and forth issue between these two kings hundreds of years before they took place. And it's like getting intimate in details. It's like they're like God's in their bedroom talking about things that they're involved in. And then when you get to the end, in verse 33 or so, it says, "Those are the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join them by intrigue. And some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, purge them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time." That's talking about the period of time of the Maccabees. So if you've ever looked at the like a Catholic Bible, the apocryphal books, First and Second Maccabees, it's speaking about that period. And it's kind of they go through this whole history of these two kings, and then put in this little parenthesis that talks about that ending there. And then it talks about another king, and this is the prophecy of the willful king. And it says, "Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done." And most commentators think that that's talking about the Antichrist. So one of the things, and I don't want to make this too complex, but one of the things that happens in this prophecy previously is it talks about a guy who's coming along that was called Antiochus Epiphanes. And he is one of the first guys to defile the temple. And this willful king, he was a type of the willful king who's coming later, who's going to defile the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. And that's, okay, so Antichrist territory, short version is what I'm telling you. And so it says he's going to speak blasphemies against the God of gods and will prosper till the wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. And then it goes on and says, "He shall regard neither the God of his fathers." That's an interesting phrase, because the God of his fathers, that's like, the God of my fathers is the Lord God, right? If you go back far in my family, not my immediate family, but far back, God of my fathers is the Lord God. This is a Jewish book, so the God of his fathers is probably talking about Yahweh, right? And so it's one of the indications that when the Antichrist comes, he may come from Jewish heritage. And so that's a possibility. And it says, "Nor the desire of women." Now, there have been some people who've said that the Antichrist, because of that, may be homosexual. That's a possibility. But the desire of women was an idiom that was talking about the Messiah. In the Old Testament, women wanted to have children, and part of the reason that they wanted to have children was because the family line endured, and that whole thing. You had retirement. Your children were your retirement. Keep that in mind. It's biblical for you older people. Your children are your retirement. And But the desire of women was Messiah, because of the promise in Genesis 3. And so he shall regard neither the God of his fathers nor the Messiah, is again how that may be phrased, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above them all. And we know famously from the New Testament in 2 Thessalonians 2 that what he does is proclaims himself to be God in the temple, and he defiles the temple that way. It says, in their place he shall honor a God of fortresses. And what that means is he's a guy who honors military might instead of the Lord God. And a God which his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. And so a large percentage of his GNP, gross national product, goes to military might. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. And this is talking about the conquest of the Antichrist. In the book of Revelation, it says this guy goes out riding on a white horse, and he has a crown on his head, and it's a victor's crown, and he has a bow in his hand, and he goes out conquering and to conquer. And in the first battle that he's identified with, a quarter of the earth's population dies. And so that's the kind of battle we're talking about. And then it says, at the time of the end, so he's gone through this whole advancing of his glory, and he's conquered the world in the sense of, the Bible talks about a one-world government, and this guy's the head of it. And then it says, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him, like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. And so you have three guys here now. You have the king of the south, you have the king of the north, and you have the he. And that again is the Antichrist. That's one of the reasons that it's an indication that you're talking about something different than previous places in the prophecy in chapter 11. So there's a rebellion against him, and he comes in and he begins putting down this rebellion that takes place. And the king of the north and the king of the south are specifically mentioned. So the north is this direction, and obviously the south is this direction. And so you have armies from the north, and you have armies from the south. It says that, verse 41, it says, he shall also enter the glorious land, that's this place, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. That's Jordan. So Jordan is Ammon, Edom, and Moab. And Jordan is interesting because there's some passages in the Bible that indicate that some of the people of Israel during this period of time run there, and they are protected over in Jordan from a lot of the battles that are taking place. So that's kind of interesting. And then it says, he shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many, and he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas, literally in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. Okay, so basically this is the precursor to the Battle of Armageddon, is what we're talking about here. So the Antichrist, there's an uprising in this area, and the uprising, it looks like, happens in Egypt. It also looks like Antichrist has transferred his headquarters from what would probably be Europe to Iraq, and possibly specifically Babylon. And when he hears news out of Egypt, he comes south, takes care of the issues in Egypt, and when he does that, there's an attack that comes from the north and from the Far East. And when you get to the New Testament, turn over to Revelation chapter 12, I think it is. Oh, no. It's chapter 9. Verse 13. This is a series of judgments in the book of Revelation. This is the sixth trumpet judgment. It says, the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who were bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million, and I heard the number of them. It goes on to say, verse 18, by these three plagues, a third of mankind was killed by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which came out of their mouths. And so there's a battle that takes place, and it involves an army of 200 million men who apparently have some connection with the river Euphrates. Okay? Now turn over to Revelation chapter 16. Revelation chapter 16. This is the famous Armageddon passage. Before I read this to you, one of the things I want to let you know is that the book of Revelation is, it's got a pattern to it. And so you have seal judgments, you have trumpet judgments, you have bowl judgments. You have some others in there too. But the pattern goes like this. There are 6 judgments, and then there's a parenthesis, and in the parenthesis you have an encouragement to the reader. And then you get the 7th judgment. So 6 seals, and then in Revelation chapter 7, it talks about there's 144,000 Jewish believers. And it looks like they have something to do with evangelizing Gentile peoples. And then you have a group of Gentiles that nobody can number, and they're all believers now. And so there's lots of people getting saved during the tribulation period. And then you go to the 7th seal. In the 9th, or in the trumpet judgments, it's the same pattern. 6 trumpets, and then there's a parenthesis, and I read part of the parenthesis this morning. So that whole thing with the 2 witnesses is part of that parenthesis. There's another section in chapter 10 that's also a part of that parenthesis. And it's talking about the fact that God is still in control of things, and he's still doing things. And then you go to the 7th trumpet judgment. And you have the same pattern here. There are 6 bowl judgments, and then there's an encouragement to the reader. So basically, when you read the book of Revelation, it's like, oh, bad, 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 bad. And then God just throws in, okay, there's some good things happening, and here it is, and then bad. And moves on like that. So, verse 12, it says, then the 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates. And so Euphrates is mentioned again. The Euphrates River runs down through Iraq, the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? And its water was dried up so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. So there is a drying up, apparently, of the Euphrates River, and the reason that happens is so that the armies from the Far East can get across it. Euphrates is a natural barrier. And so that's a good possibility. There's a dam on the Euphrates River that can dry it up. Okay, that's modern times, once again. Couldn't have happened before. And then it says, and I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. And the dragon, the beast is the Antichrist, false prophet is his PR guy, the dragon is Satan. And the frogs that are coming out of his mouth, that represents demons and false teaching and that kind of stuff. This it goes on, verse 14, and identifies it there. The spirits of demons performing signs, which go out to the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. And so specifically, this gathering of nations, the end times events, are designed by Satan to get the armies of the world right here. He wants them right here. Guess what? This is where Jesus is coming. And so the Bible talks about the fact that Jesus is coming to Israel. And so he's coming down from, if you go back to the Old Testament, Isaiah 63, he's coming from the south. I could tell you the flight plan. This is where we're going to be going. He's coming from Edom, which is down that direction. And he's coming Edom, you'd be going up northwest, and he's going to come and stop off at Jerusalem and stop a battle that's taking place there. And then he's going to come up here, and he's going to wipe these guys out. And that's the flight plan of Christ when he comes back. And so it says that he's gathering together the armies of the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. And here's the encouragement. Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. The idea of keeping your garments, when you were put on guard duty back in these times, if they caught you sleeping, they didn't wake you up and court-martial you. They just took a torch and they put your robes on fire. And so that would stop you from sleeping. And that's what it means to keep your garments. And they gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon. And so, like Avi was telling you, this is Megiddo, and this is the hill of Megiddo, or the mountain of Megiddo, right here. This is it. So they brought them to this place called Armageddon, so it's in this area. Now we're talking about this final battle that's going to take place. And then it goes on in the passage. So, that battle that takes place is a battle between the Antichrist and these enemies that are coming from the far north, and that are coming from the far east, it looks like. It talks about the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Okay, so transporting to modern times, where is the major world threat coming from right at this moment? Not North Korea's Italy. China is on the ascendancy. And so China has one of the largest economies on the planet. So they are a good possibility for the kings of the East. What's interesting about China is that back in 1963 they boasted about being able to man an army of 200 million men. They picked the number. And these guys are communists. They probably don't know the Bible. And so they said back in 63 they could field an army of 200 million men. And it's just an interesting number because there were probably only 200 million people in the Western, or in the Middle East and Africa and Asia and Europe at the time. So the whole population equals the army that's being spoken about in the Bible, and it's not until modern times that could actually take place. There's some other things that look like it takes place at this time. There is if you're coming from the east with a large army like that, logistically that's a nightmare. But if you're coming from the east with a large army like that, you have to pave the way basically. And so actually three things happen. The Euphrates River gets dried up, Babylon gets destroyed with fire and brimstone like Sodom and Gomorrah. Babylon gets destroyed, and it looks like Damascus gets destroyed too. And so these armies are coming down here to fight against the Antichrist, and boom, up goes Babylon. The Euphrates River is dried up, the armies come across, the next obstacle would be Damascus, and boom, out goes Damascus. That's in the book of Isaiah, and then these armies come down in this direction, and they end up right here. And so that's the final battle. Now, the Bible talks about the fact that Satan knows, he's the one who's gathering all these armies, right? And so it's Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet that are gathering all these armies together. And the Bible in another place talks about the fact that they're gathering these armies together to fight against the coming of the Messiah. And so they know Messiah is coming. So Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet know Messiah is coming. And then it talks about 10 kings. And most likely that's connected with Europe, it looks like. They know that Messiah is coming, that Jesus is coming also. And they gather together to fight against the coming of Christ. So, one of the things that you have with the Bible is that by the time you get to the end of the tribulation period, everybody knows what's about to happen. And so there's some agendas that are taking place. They don't want to be under the Antichrist anymore. They want to, they're bickering and fighting, and their bickering and fighting is killing a third of mankind by that point. But what it ends up with is the final battle that takes place where Jesus, it's not even really a battle, it's just a wipeout. And so the Bible talks about the blood coming up to the horse's bridle. I've got a horse, and he's over 15 hands tall. His head sits right about here. His bridle is right about here. And so that high, blood in the belly down there. When you start talking 200 million men on one side, that can be literal, you guys. And so I've done the calculations. I'm weird that way. In any case, another thing that you have is that by the end of this time, the Bible talks about horses, and chariots can mean all kinds of things. Horses in Hebrew means leapers, or it can be translated leapers. The word for horse in Hebrew is also used for birds, and so Hebrew's kind of vague that way. And so they may be using something other than actual horses, but by the time you get to the end of the tribulation period, it says that the mountains are knocked down, all the cities are knocked down, Jerusalem has been destroyed at least twice by the end of the tribulation by earthquakes. And so you have a lot of infrastructure gone at that point. And so when you get to the end of the tribulation period and the beginning of the kingdom period, it talks about people gathering together on horseback. And most likely it's because everything's so wiped out that they have to go back to that. Did you know they used horses in World War II? Yeah. And so we're not that far from that period of time. Anyway, lots of interesting stuff. One of the things that I want to leave you with is when Jesus comes back and fights this battle, he says that his wife is coming with him. And so who's the bride of Christ? Yeah. And so you're on an Israel tour, but this isn't the best one. The best one's to come, where we're coming in, flying in on the flight plan with Jesus. And I don't know if we'll be involved in the battle at all. There's some indication of that, but mostly it's just going to be standing back, watching what the Lord does in taking care of these armies. One last passage you could go look at is Zechariah chapter 14. And in Zechariah chapter 14, it talks about the Jewish nation, and it talks about a third of them will make it through the fire, and that they'll be purified, and that Messiah will save them. It talks about armies that have taken the city of Jerusalem at the time, and that Jesus, the Messiah, interrupts that battle right in the middle of it, and he lands on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives splits in two, and the people of Jerusalem are delivered at that moment, at that time. And so we're going to get to see that too. And so pretty cool stuff. Anyway, this is the place. So Har, this is Megiddo, and that's the valley. And that's what we got. All right. When I first came here, oh gosh, it was a while back. This is my third or fourth time to this place. And I was asking Avi if these are actually the hills, and do they know what, do they know which one's which, or are they just making it up? And it's like, these are the hills. And so over in 1 Samuel in chapter 17, let's go through and we'll read it. It says, now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered together at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. And they encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And you heard what Avi just said about the hills, right? Those are the names. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, right over here. Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, right over here, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. That's 9 foot 9 inches. This guy, I'm 6 foot, and I can reach just under 8 feet. And so you're talking about 1.5 feet above my hand is how big this dude was. And it says he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. It's about 125 pounds was his coat. And he had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. 15 pounds is how much the spearhead weighed. You guys that lift weights, those little dumbbells? Think of a 15-pound dumbbell, put it on the end of a stick and chuck it. See how you do. And a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. Man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. The three oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his three sons who went to battle were Eliab the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the three oldest followed Saul, but David occasionally returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. You'll remember David was singing for Saul to calm his spirit. And the Philistine drew near and presenting himself 40 days, morning and evening. What's 40 the number of? Testing. 40 is the number of testing. And drawing near, presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain, that's a large basket, and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle, for Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he's come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter and give his father's house exemption in Israel. That means exemption from taxes. Would to God that somebody in America would do that. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? What you have with David is a guy who loves the Lord, and he spent time with him out in the wilderness, and he spent time with him out in the wilderness. And so he knows who he is, and he knows what God can do. Later on, David's going to talk about the fact that he was able to fight against a bear, and he was able to kill a lion because of God's hand upon him. And David was the kind of guy who wasn't afraid of anything because he figured God's with him. And especially in a situation like this. The Philistines were the enemies, not just of Israel. They were the enemies of God and God's people. And so David recognized that this isn't just a physical battle with a guy who's 9'9". This is a spiritual battle that's going to take place, and God's going to be fighting on his side. And so, when it's me against, a bunch of people, I'm outnumbered. But it's when it's me and God against a bunch of people, or one 9'9" guy, I win every single time. That's David's attitude. It's something that more of us need to have. And he says, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? I like the attitude there. And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so it shall be done for the man who kills him. And repeated to him what they'd said before. And the people, verse 28, it says, now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you've come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? That's a great example of brothers talking to each other. I'm an eldest brother, right? And so I've got a brother who's 2 years younger than me. David was far removed from Eliab. And so Eliab would be a full-grown man. David's just a youth. He's probably a teenager. He's probably somewhere around 15, 16, maybe 17 years old at this point. And Eliab is a grown man. Eliab's gone to war. Eliab's been here for 40 days listening to this guy come out from the army of the Philistines and defying God. And Eliab is too chicken to go out and fight with him. And David comes up, and David's like, what in the world are we doing here? Who's this uncircumcised Philistine? Who's this guy coming up and talking all this, all this trash? When I played football, one of the things that you didn't do was talk trash, because somebody would come up and thump you. And that's David's attitude too. It's a biblical attitude. In any case, when Eliab sees what David's doing, probably what you've got going on there is he's not just looking at his little brother and thinking, David's talking it up again. Probably what's happening there is he's a little bit convicted, because here's his little brother, a little teenage kid who's coming up and wondering about what's going on and why isn't anybody going down and challenging Goliath. And that would make an older brother go, and that's probably what's going on. So David says, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? And he turned away from him and toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. So David turns around and goes, what is it that the king's going to do for us if we do this? And I think that David doesn't need more information. I think that what he's doing is he's trying to either encourage or embarrass the guys who are around him, or maybe a little bit of both. So the king said that certain things would happen to these guys, and so like I'm talking to Gil, what is it that the king said? And then Eliab comes up and he's like, what is it that the king said? And it's one of those things where he's trying to get the people of God to act like the people of God, basically. And so, verse 31, it says, when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. In other words, David, this guy has been fighting battles. This guy has been trained from the time that he was your age, and you're just a kid. You can't fight against him. And look at David's answer. Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth, and when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Now think of that. He's talking about a lion here. So a lion comes up and takes one of the flock, and one of the things with shepherds is you were responsible for the sheep in your flock, and you had to pay for them. And so if one of your sheep was missing, you paid for that unless you went and got the sheep back from the animal that had taken it. And so you could come back with the remains of the sheep or whatever. You just had to have proof that you didn't take it down to the marketplace and sell it. Okay, so that's what's happening there. And so the lion comes in and takes one of the lambs, and David just goes after him. And I don't think that he waited until the lion was done eating him. That's not what it looks like. It looks like he came in and grabbed the lamb. And you know what a lion will do? You've watched National Geographic and all those shows. They'll come in and they'll grab an animal and they'll just take it off, and they may not kill it. And so David, as soon as the lion came to come after one of his sheep, he jumped down, went after it, and he grabbed the lion by its beard. So it's like comes up and grabs him by the beard and then whacks him with a rod. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Shepherds had a staff, and that was for catching sheep, and usually had a crook on it, because sheep kind of, it depends on if they know you or not. They don't want to get near you sometimes, and so you have to reach out and touch them. You reach out and touch them and grab them and pull them in. But a rod was something that was used to protect yourself. And so he's coming up and he's grabbing a lion by the bottom of its chin and smacking it in the head until it's dead. That's a pretty bold move. That's a pretty gutsy guy there. And then he goes on and he says, verse 36, your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. It's not because David's such a great warrior. It's not because David has killed a lion and a bear on his own. He's making the point that God was with him while he was a shepherd, and this guy's already toast, because he's not just a lion or a bear who has come out after a sheep. He's a guy who's come up and defied God himself. So it's just a matter of being the guy that God uses to take the guy out. That's basically what he's talking about. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor, and he tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I've not tested them. So David took them off. And what it's talking about, it's not the idea that David's too little for Saul's armor, although he probably was. The Bible says that Saul stood head and shoulders above every man in Israel. And the Bible doesn't talk about David being a tall man necessarily, but he was a warrior. And so, when you get to the age that David's at, he's probably pretty much gone through his growth spurt. He's probably close to being as big as he's going to be. It's not an issue of necessarily the armor is too big. It's an issue of he's not used to armor. He's never used it. And so he doesn't want to go into battle being encumbered with something that he doesn't know how to use. This is a good thing to remember as Christians. The Bible talks about the fact that we're in spiritual warfare, and part of that spiritual warfare is sharing the gospel with people. You do know that, right? Spiritual warfare isn't about protecting yourself from the devil. It's about protecting yourself from the devil so you can share the gospel with people. That's what spiritual warfare is about. And so, a lot of times we get kind of our spiritual heroes and we try to become like them and we try to mimic them. And I'm not talking about, you've been sitting under somebody and you've heard some stories and things like that and you like to use those when you're talking. It's like you literally want to act just like them, that kind of thing. I've known some guys, Chuck Smith was the founder of Calvary Chapel, and Chuck talked like this, and he would say, "I believe," and he would rotate his hand like this, and he would share the word, and he would make long pauses in between words and sentences, and he'd do stuff like that. I have literally seen Calvary pastors act just like him, like even with the hand motion. I believe, and that kind of thing. That's putting on Saul's armor. You're trying to be like somebody else. You don't need to be like somebody else. You don't need to, basically you don't want to be a bad copy of someone else. You want to be a good example of you. That's the idea, and that's what David is doing here. Obviously, he's going into physical warfare. We go into spiritual warfare. And so verse 40, it says, then he took his staff in his hand, that's his shepherd's staff, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. And you guys, that's it. That's the brook. And so it may not have been in the same place. You know how streams go. They can travel across the valley, but the way that it's shaped, and you look at the limestone on that cliff right there, it's obviously sloughed off over time. So this stream's been here for quite a while, and it may be in pretty much the same area that it was during the time of David. And so David's coming from that hill right over there, and he's coming down to meet the Philistines down in this area. And as he's going, he's got to cross over here, and he's coming down to this brook right here. Probably right here is where it's happening, because this is, there's the 2 places. Shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And so probably right in here somewhere, David comes down and he just stoops down and gets 5 smooth stones, because he's going to use the weapon that he knows. And we know the end of this story. And so he takes his sling in his hand. He puts the stones in a shepherd's bag in a pouch he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Why did he pick 5 stones? Betty.
Because Goliath had 4 brothers.
Right on. Goliath had 4 brothers. And so we don't know that for sure, but that's David's attitude. And so this guy's famous, and he's like, I'm going against a big guy, and he's probably got, when I was down in Southern California, I don't want to repeat that. When you fight one guy, in a group, sometimes you got to fight the whole group, basically. And so that's what he's figuring. He's figuring that he may have to go up against other guys, his Goliath's brothers. And so he picks up 5 smooth stones. He only needs 1 for Goliath. He figures we'll take out the other 4 with the rest of them. And so it says in verse 41, so the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." And so the Philistine says, "Come here, I'm going to feed you to the birds." And David goes, "You know what? I'm cutting your head off, and I'm going to feed you to the birds and all your pals too. Everybody's becoming bird food today." And again, I like that attitude. I think that's good. Then David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine. Oh, excuse me, I missed the best part. Verse 48, "And it was so, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David," you can imagine this guy lumbering up to meet David, "that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. So, have you watched that movie David with Richard Gere? It was done back in the 80s. Like, worst movie ever. Like, worst movie ever. And the scene with Goliath and David in it, worst scene ever. Because they're trying to make it all dramatic and stuff, and Richard Gere is out there in his underwear, and he's got a sling going around, and he's slinging stones at Goliath, and he's not doing very well, and he's running backwards and all that stuff. And that's not what David did. What David did was he saw the guy's coming, he comes lumbering up, and so David just runs as fast as he can at him, doing this kind of stuff, and then he lets it go, smacks him. And that's the next verse. "Then David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth." What's Goliath got on his head? A helmet. What are helmets for? To protect your head, right? And so, do helmets sit up here? Yeah. Every Philistine helmet that I've ever seen comes down over the forehead. And then, a lot of times they'll have a ridge piece that goes down over the top of their nose. They come down on the sides like this. It's designed to protect your head. So how'd David get his forehead? And admittedly, Goliath's a big guy, and maybe his helmet doesn't fit. Maybe that's what's going on. We had these guys, we had linemen when I was in college, and they would put a helmet on, and it would go on, and their foreheads would wrinkle up, and their helmet would sit up like this. And so maybe Goliath was like that, but I kind of think that he probably had a helmet that fit. And so if he's got a helmet that fits, and David's slinging a stone at him, and it sinks into his forehead, that's pretty intense. So it sounds like it might have gone through the helmet, basically. And again, when you're talking about the battle that David had with Goliath, David recognized that he wasn't in the battle alone. It was the Lord that was with him. And so David's doing everything that he can to fight the battle that God's given him. He's running towards Goliath. He's probably doing that for two reasons: intimidation, which, Goliath's like 9'9". Oh, here comes the little boy running at me. I'll just wait till he gets here. So he's 9'9", doing that kind of stuff. Intimidation, but it's probably to get every amount of momentum he can into the stone that he's slinging. But I don't think it's just David's hand that gets the stone to Goliath. I think the Lord's hand is in it too. And that puppy sinks in the guy's forehead. And that's it for Goliath. And so he ran. It says, so David prevailed over the Philistine, verse 50, with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David, so he had to borrow one. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. That's down this way, down that direction. And the wounded of the Philistines fell among the road to Sha'arim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son this young man is." Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him, brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. He's carrying his head, dripping. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." And what you have there is David finally gets noticed. He has been in the household of Saul before this point. He's been playing the lyre for him, the harp for Saul, to calm him when his spirit goes wacko. And Saul doesn't recognize him. Saul was kind of one of those guys that was just into what he was doing and into himself. And so he didn't recognize the ministry that David was doing with him before this point. And it wasn't until David was shown to be the warrior that he was that Saul even started asking about the guy. And nobody in Saul's group knew who David was. And David had to identify himself. In any case, when you go through and you look at this is a great passage on spiritual warfare. A lot of times we look at things that are going on around us, and sometimes there are things that are, they look so big, they look so huge. They look like they're obstacles that can't be overcome. And you know what? It may be absolutely true. If I'm going up against a 9'9" guy, I'm a little nervous, and I'm 6 foot. David was probably right around 5 foot, somewhere around there, 5'2" or right in there, because that's the height people were back at that point. And so I'm going up against a big guy like that, and it looks like it's something that can't be done, even my size. And there are things that happen in our lives that look like they're going to overwhelm us, and they may be overwhelming, and it may be actually true. You know, a lot of people in America are suffering from depression, and they have every reason to be suffering from depression. They've got a lot of junk that's going on in their lives. But one of the things that we always need to remember is that we've got a God who cares about us. We've got a God who's more powerful than anything that comes up against us. And we can trust in him to take care of our lives and to help us to overcome any kind of obstacle that's in front of us. Goliath is a great picture of the flesh. You know, a lot of times we're struggling with problems in our life that have to do specifically with our flesh. Usually that's the issue when you're a Christian. You want to serve the Lord, you want to do the things that God wants you to do, and you keep coming up short, you keep failing. 40 days and 40 nights of testing, and you're the guy who can't get it done. And what God wants us to know is, again, you're the guy who can't get it done. But the guy who can get it done is with you. And that's the difference between David and Eliab. It's the difference between those two. Eliab was a guy who was trusting in his own strength, and he was afraid. And frankly, he knew that he couldn't get it done. And David was a guy who was going to trust in the Lord's strength, and he wasn't afraid because he knew the Lord could do just anything. He could do anything. And he trusted him to do it. Now, David was involved, obviously. He's got a sling, he's got stones. He's not pretending to be a great warrior or anything. He's just a shepherd. But he's got a sling and he's got stones, and his sling is the Lord's sling, and the stones come from the creation the Lord has. And you know, he's going to go after everything that needs to get gone after. So Goliath and his 4 brothers, if they show up, and he does that. One other thing is Goliath being a picture of the flesh. The Bible says that Goliath died twice here.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Is that a mistake? Yeah. Is that a mistake? No. The Holy Spirit's making a point there. And so again, when you're looking at the whole issue of the flesh, you want your flesh to be twice dead. You know, it's like you kill it, and then you make sure it's dead. It's that kind of thing. And so David went up and smacked him with a stone. It's obvious. You got a stone buried in your forehead, you're a dead guy. You know, it's not going to be good for you from that point on. And David just makes sure that he's dead, and he finds Goliath's sword and he hacks his head off with it. He's good and dead is the idea there. And it's the same thing with our flesh. It needs to be good and dead. So when it rises up, and it'll do that at times, you smack it one, and then you cut its head off. Carry the head around, that kind of thing. Make sure it's dead. And when we do that, our walk with God becomes a pretty awesome thing. And so, you know, David and Goliath, right there. one of the high points in David's life, and it happened right here. And so, you could just think of. I know that we've got the wheat here and that kind of thing because we're here in the spring, but just think of the armies of the Philistines lined up, and the Philistine champion coming out in front of him, shouting and talking it up and big mouth and all of that, and David just coming up and running at him and taking him down. And again, same thing with us. Let's see. There was something else I wanted to say, and I can't remember what it was. That's good.
Hey, Steve.
Number one.